So it has been quite a while. I've decided to go back to school, taking some more classes, working away, and wondering when I'm going to make another video. When I come across this link, put it up on screen now. The Apocalypse tank from Red Alert 3 versus the Mammoth tank of Tiberium Wars. 10 Apocalypse tanks along with 5 Hammer tanks and 2 Sickles from Red Alert 3 versus 10 standard Mammoth tanks along with 5 Predator tanks and 2 Wolverines from Tiberium Wars 3. Who would win? I thought, ooh, this is from 2019, but sounds like something I would want to be a part of. And I don't think anybody's going to respond to me, so I decided to just go ahead and make a video of it. I haven't done a video on the Red Alert 3 Apocalypse tank because I've been wanting to do the Red Alert stuff after I was done with the Tiberium universe stuff. But doesn't seem like I am moving at the pace where that is really going to be an issue. So I thought I'd go ahead and do this. I'd like to make a Apocalypse tank video after this video and start doing a bunch of different stuff from both universes and maybe some of these scenario videos. But I don't know, I'm still going through school, so I may not have time. Anyway, to start off, we're looking at the Apocalypse tank versus the Mammoth tank. The Mammoth tank I've done a video on. I'm going to have to go and re-record that though because the audio quality sounds terrible. But most of that is known. The Mammoth tank from Tiberium Wars, basically from the Tiberium universe, is enormous. It is massive. I'll show a picture on screen now of what it was supposed to look like during the Renegade period, during the first Tiberium War, and it was massive, massive, massive. Now, these tanks might have a similar lineage, because whether or not you subscribe to the theory that the Red Alert timeline, Red Alert 1, was the precursor to the Tiberium timeline, they might have the same Soviet lineage. In this case, we are just going to assume that is the case for this video because there was a lot of stuff about the Apocalypse tank that I was not able to find in either the cursory look through the games or the look through the wikis. So I'm just going to assume a lot of stuff about the Apocalypse tank based off of wiki information about the Apocalypse tank from Red Alert 1. Now, to start that off, the Mammoth tank, frickin' massive. The Apocalypse tank, you see it in various different portions of the Red Alert games. It is not nearly as big, and that could count in its favor or it could count in its detriment. Because what a lot of the tank YouTubers will tell you, and this is completely true, is that it is a lot easier to hit a much larger tank. And a much smaller tank is a lot nippier. While neither of these vehicles is particularly fast, I actually think that the Mammoth tank will be a faster vehicle. In Red Alert 1, from what I can find in a cursory glance through the CNC wiki, which, by the way, this is all very cursory. I'm doing this on a Thursday right before I have to start work. But on a cursory look, it does not appear as though the Mammoth tank from Red Alert 1 was a tank that was run by nuclear power. So most likely it is then a diesel vehicle, like many vehicles coming out of World War II. Or could possibly be a turbine-turned vehicle. But either way, that means this thing is going to be very slow. Very, very slow. One of its main offensive tactics, the one from the Red Alert 3 game, is to use a magnetic lance to pull smaller vehicles towards it so that it can grind it up. Because it has no chance of catching up to most vehicles on its own. This is a problem because the Mammoth could go 25 miles an hour on uneven terrain at full load, while this thing could probably manage 10. And speed is a really big factor when you're as big a target as these things would be. The next question, I guess, would be the firepower. And as big as the Mammoth tank, the Apocalypse tank rather, is, and how big its cannons are in the game, it only has a 125mm Draken cannon. Now, this is actually only slightly larger than a modern Abrams tank. So the model is actually outsized for what it would appear if it was in a real-life situation. This is different from the Mammoth tank Mk3, which has dual 150mm cannons, along with a pair of 4.75-inch missile pods designed specifically to attack infantry and aircraft. This means that the Apocalypse tank is very well undergunned when compared to the same piece. The Apocalypse tank is made up of 16-layered reinforced steel armor. Now, most of the tanks that are around today and in the Tiberium universe have long foregone layered steel armor as a realistic defensive tool. Most of it is composite armors and ceramic sheathing. Now, these things are able to protect the vehicle at a much higher thickness rate than actual steel armor, which means in this case, the Apocalypse tank is also under-armored by quite a bit. I'm not sure how much 16 layers of reinforced steel armor is, but if we take a charitable estimate and say it has the armor level of the heaviest actual tank ever, the Maus, that would mean that the Apocalypse tank has around 220mm of armor, at least in the front, 200mm in the turret on the side, the rear, 200mm in the hull front, 180 in the hull side, and 150 in the hull rear. Now, not only is that very underpowered versus the Mammoth tank, that is underpowered versus the M1 Abrams, which has an average frontal armor estimate of 350mm versus discarding Sabot rounds, and 700 versus high explosive anti-tank rounds. Now, that was just a American author's estimates about the Abrams. The Soviet estimates were 470mm versus discarding Sabot rounds, and 650mm versus high explosive anti-tank rounds, meaning by some estimates the Apocalypse tank has less than half the amount of armor effectively as an Abrams tank. Now, I guess we could up-armor it to, say, a Abrams tank and level steel armor, but take into account the Maus, massive, with all that steel armor, was only able to move 12 miles an hour on absolutely perfect ground. This would mean that the Apocalypse tank is less than half as fast on good terrain as the Mammoth tank is on poor terrain. Let's not even talk about what it would have to do on an incline. This isn't looking very good for the Apocalypse tank. Now, their one big weapon that I think they could use to defeat the Mammoth tank, because the Mammoth tank defeats almost anything that the Nod can throw at it, including super heavy lasers and 100mm tank rounds every day of the week. The one consistent weapon that it might be able to use to overcome this is the harpoon gun, as in the universe that chews stuff up and spits it out no problem, except for the fact that the Apocalypse tank is smaller than the Mammoth tank. The Mammoth tank has a massive crew, and we've seen the Apocalypse tank, and based on its previous versions, it is not that large. Granted, it can crush vehicles that are potentially suggested to be the size of Abrams tanks, or maybe a little bit smaller, but that does not mean it reaches quite the size of the Mammoth tank. Now, if you're going to have something that's smaller and that might be a problem for it. There is a question, however, about how much the Apocalypse tank weighs. The Apocalypse tank weighs a great deal, possibly as much as the Maus itself, which would be 188 tons. This might actually mean that it outweighs the Mammoth tank, which is strange to sound, but in the video I did point out that the Mammoth tank is actually much closer to a Abrams tank than it is to the Maus. Realistically speaking, both of these vessels are very underpowered compared to their size. If something the size of the Mammoth tank would exist, it would be probably closer to the armament of the Rat, the gigantic guns that they had on that. But that's not really what we're talking about. Going over the stats there a little bit, let's look at the matchup. 10 Apocalypse tanks, along with 5 Hammer tanks, 2 Sickles from Red Alert 3, 10 standard Mammoth tanks, 5 Predator tanks, and 2 Wolverines from Tiberium Wars 3. Now, let's take each thing in kind here. The Apocalypse tank is inferior to the Mammoth tank in almost every way. In fact, I think it might actually be inferior to its previous version. The Hammer tanks are very powerful tanks, yet they also suffer from the problem of being severely under-armored compared to their Predator tank counterparts. So I'm going to say that the Hammer tanks are inferior to the Predator tanks. The Sickles are very interesting in that they are very technologically adept for something the Soviets could make, but they are also inferior compared to the Wolverines. The Wolverines are much faster, much more adept at moving about, and have much better targeting information, whereas the Sickles are a bunch of conscripts sitting in a basket shooting out with miniguns. I don't think they're going to last long versus something that is firing 30mm shells in a Gatling cannon. If we were to put this up in a city environment, I don't know exactly how it would go. I'm guessing that the Tiberium Wars units would win, although this might be a very awkward fight, as each time a Apocalypse tank would get knocked out, it would block the entire street. So the next thing that they would have to be is either go over the tank, which even the Mammoth tank might not be able to do, or find a way around in the middle of the city. And by the end of this, you're going to be blocked in by the burning wrecks of whichever side ends up winning. I don't think that the Apocalypse tank from Red Alert 3, the Hammer tanks, and the Sickles really have very much of a chance here. And that makes me sad because the Red Alert stuff, Red Alert 3, has always been some of my favorite of the games because of their creativity and how they built these things. But there's just no getting over the fact that the GDI is just so much further ahead than the Soviet Union in everything. Every single thing that they do is inferior, and that's not their fault. The Tiberium Wars setting has just had so many more years to advance from the Cold War, whereas the Red Alert series really hasn't. And if we were to put these things up as equals, everything is equal, I still think they would lose because you're handing the Red Alert people fewer capabilities. I don't think that even given the same amount of armor that a Mammoth tank would lose to the Apocalypse, because the Apocalypse has smaller guns. The Wolverines have larger guns than the Sickles, and you get the point. In this battle, I would give it 9 times out of 10 to the Tiberium Wars group. Thank you to the Police, Adalberto, Just Killing Time, Link Store, M3 Lee, whirlwind for this interesting scenario that I came across. I don't think you'll probably ever see this video, but if you do, this was really interesting. This is really fun to do, so thank you. And I guess that'll be the end of this video. I'd like to do the Apocalypse tank next, but we'll see. That might come out next week or it might come out 5 months from now. We will find out. Thank you for tuning in for another episode of, well, I guess we haven't come up with a name for this series. I guess Tiberium Versus or Command & Conquer Versus might be an interesting name for this. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you all later.